session workshop held on Monday, July 10th, 2017. Today we'll be reviewing the IMA contract and then have time for board feedback.
Okay, so in your packets for this week, there were a number of documents. Tonight we're going to focus on the current draft IMA charter school contract. Included with that was a cover memo to hopefully highlight some of the areas for your attention. Hopefully a lot of the contract looks familiar. It's similar to a lot of the terms and language in many of our charter school contracts. What I'd like to do tonight is kind of focus on the areas where there's been substantial individualization for IMACS. And that's going to be the lottery/attendance area, the budget and finances section, and then the renewal section, or the section that looks at student performance expectations. With respect to the lottery and attendance area, this has taken quite a bit of work given some changes to the statute that were made during the last biennial budget process. And primarily those changes really spoke to the lottery process and added some definition to the lottery process and preferences. DPI's interpretation of that statute has been, now that the statutory language speaks to that, that there is only limited interpretation. So they are of the view that there can only be a singular random lottery, which impacts some of the original proposal language regarding a 50-50 Montessori experienced, non-Montessori experienced lottery. It also impacts the drawing of attendance areas. Because while attendance area residence is an eligibility criteria, they are interpreting that as a hard yes or no. Either yes, you are eligible because you live in the attendance area, or no, you are not, which by defining an attendance area very narrowly could impact the ability to fill the available seats, because it would not allow for us to use internal transfer the way we've used internal transfer previously. And then the other area is the area of the admissions preferences, which set forth that both sibling and continuing as a member of the school community are statutorily required preferences. And then it allows for 3 other discretionary preferences, those being the founder's preference, governance council preference, and full-time employee. And full-time employee is in the law. All of those being capped at 10% combined of the total enrollment. And so that area does look a little different than some of our previous ones, and I wanted to highlight that. We have introduced the notion of a transportation zone. I say we have, in that it's something I've kind of made up, but we are working with DPI because I also don't want to offer to you for final approval at the end of the month something that would not pass muster on DPI's interpretation. And so that is something we're continuing to work with them on. I'm going to go through the major and then we'll open it up. The budget and finances, first and foremost, the budget does look a little different, the numbers, and that is partly because the total enrollment is different. So anything that is based on a when you're doing math, A plus B equal an equation, like, right, it's the equation changes when the number changes. That's why I'm a lawyer and not a mathematician. The other is adding some caveats about the fundraising expectations. That is a lesson learned from some previous work we've done on and you'll see that there are expectations that IMACS meet its stated fundraising, and that if it doesn't, then local public funds would be withheld in the upcoming year, and that repeated consecutive failures to meet fundraising expectations could be considered a for-cause reason for termination of the contract. The other nuance in there is the 3K programming. So we have grade banded courses in the Montessori model. 3K through 5K is the Nido band, or primary band. And obviously as the district we don't offer 3K, but that is part of the model. So it's trying to find that right financial balance of who is responsible financially for 3K. And the way it is currently structured is that we would essentially hire the staff, because it's not one 3K teacher, one 4K teacher, one 5K teacher, but really 2 teachers for the 3K, 5K band. And then IMA Inc., a separate private entity, separate from the IMACS Charter School Governance Council, would reimburse the cost of that, plus a 2.5% administrative fee. The administrative costs are something we, for our charter schools, don't generally charge, but we would charge it for the 3K work. Finally, I went back and watched videos both of the approval of IMACS, but also of Badger Rock, to kind of see what were any sticking points in those previously negotiated contracts. In the student performance and accountability measures, both the impact of failure to meet those and the statement of them as standards was a concern that was raised. If you'll recall with the Badger Rock, I did say that I believed even the language that was included there was minimally compliant with the law. But recognizing that there were still some concerns, I did try to link it more clearly to the SIP process. The SIP process establishes specific numerical expectations of improvement, percentage rating, and we have kind of a formula. That was the word I was originally looking for, not equation. A formula that kind of says, if you have this much room to grow, these are your growth expectations. This one was slightly more complicated because with Badger Rock, we were working with a known and established baseline. We don't have a known and established baseline. So it's organized so that that first year gives us our performance baseline, and that each year thereafter, the minimum targets are those established through the school improvement planning process. Also, that is directly linked to the non-renewal expressly, and creates a rebuttable presumption of non-renewal for failure to meet those standards. So it tries to wed those high expectations with some concerns that have been expressed by a board member, that if the only way we measure a school is through their standardized test performance, it's just not something we're comfortable with, and we believe that there are more to our schools and more to our students. So it allows us to put a lot of weight in that, but not, okay, that's it, all said and done. It leaves discretion with the board. During the course of the last few days, we have gotten some feedback already from various groups that I think will warrant some additions or changes to the contract between now and July 31st. Some questions were raised about IMA Inc. and which portions of the building are we using, what are we subleasing back from them, what if they want to run a summer program that's for profit for them, not for profit, they're non-for-profit, but that charges a fee. So we will add some language to be very clear about our rental spaces and all of those policies applying to IMA Inc., because those would not be considered school-sponsored activities. We've also had lots of questions about demographics of students. There's lots of, I think, questions about how are we going to ensure that the demographics of the Isthmus Montessori Academy Charter School reflects that of their intended attendance area, which is not an attendance area but a transportation zone, and the district as a whole. And we can't set caps or quotas or race-based preferences. But what we can do is really look at and focus on the recruitment efforts and look at, add language around year 3. Year 3 is when they have to notify us of intent to seek renewal. We've expanded that renewal process some. And I think it would be a great year to add some language about a dipstick test for general enrollment. Are you meeting your enrollment expectations? Are you exceeding your enrollment expectations? what do the demographics of the school look like? What do the finances look like? And the other one, which is kind of that unknown right now, is transportation. How is transportation playing out? Do we have to create new routes? Are they actually all being integrated into existing routes? So I think I have not thought of the language yet. It's still a new notion in my mind, but using that renewal section of the contract to have a 3-year dipstick test to really look at that information is also something that I've heard loud and clear. And so with that, I'm here and available for questions and or comments, and really excited that we have 3 weeks between now and the regular board meeting.
I figured kind of try and go in the order that you went in, and then maybe hit some other things that weren't there. On the lottery, there was an email from Kelly today in response to Anna that talked about the process for enrollment for inter-district transfers.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't clear, you know, that they have to apply for the transfer into the district, and they have to apply to the lottery.
Mm-hmm.
Can we do a preference in the lottery for students who are MMSD students?
That's a good question. So I think it's a double-edged sword, right? I think it's so I want to think about it a little bit, right? We recognize that there is an opportunity to have open enrolled students which come with new funds.
But the funds are identical to we actually
Right.
lose money on open enrolled students.
So I don't think there is a way to preference. I will pressure test that as I think through. And so I think some of it may be if we identify. So right now I said there's just no geographic boundary with MMSD that identifies as the attendance area. And so I also didn't say MMSD is defined as the attendance area for that nuance to allow open enrollment if we have the capacity to do that. So I think it would be thinking of how the dominoes fall between admission into IMACS, or whether it's an automatic placement on a wait list if a wait list exists, and then only being granted IMCS if your open enrollment is granted, and then you would get in off the wait list. So that would be the way that I could see perhaps doing it. I would have to think about it through kind of some of the new rules.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
I think it is, because if, you know, the budget model here projects that it will be the cost per student will be higher than the open enrollment amount, and therefore therefore it's really difficult to ask the citizens and taxpayers of Madison to pay for extra costs for open enrolled in students who are taking a lottery slot from MMSD students. I mean,
Yep.
that's a big ask.
No,
and one that I hope we can find a way around if this.
I mean, there are two
continues.
ways. There's defining being an MMSD resident as an eligibility criteria, which is a yes or a no. Either
Right.
yes you are or no
Right.
you're not. And then no, that is just simply not one of our locations where open enrollment is available. Because remember, open enrollment would guarantee you a spot in the district, not a spot in a
Right.
building in the district, right? So that's one way. There's also some way to figuring out if it's actually being notified of your approval of open enrollment that then gets you essentially on the wait list because the lottery would have already been run.
Yeah, the timing matters. on
Yeah,
things
so,
like that.
but again, those are just ways to do that. I don't know what the overall opinion is on open enrollment into the school.
Uh,
I mean, we turn open enrollment on and off for our existing schools within.
We do.
So couldn't we just?
Well, we
turn it on
turn,
and
we
off
turn
and see?
internal transfer on and off
Yep.
for our existing school. Open enrollment, it's just because it's a slightly different order that the domino falls for open enrollment. And that's why we turn it on, is to preference internal transfer over open enrollment so that our own residents have a better shot at than But yeah, so open enrollment is just the timing window slightly complicates it. So I just got to think through it a little bit.
Okay. Well, we'll see we'll see what comes out of it. The other question is, I just want to, what I've understood from hearing is that the grade band as a lottery dimension will pass muster with DPI?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So because a grade band is not actually a preference or even a criteria, it's a capacity. So we're just defining our capacity in those classrooms. So we're not expected to take on more kids in any classroom setting than we have capacities for. So it's actually a capacity determination that then drives our lottery.
Okay. I mean, I just want to make sure that that you'd been back and forth
Yes.
with DPI on that, and that would pass muster, because that's kind of also a key part of the other one. The other thing is that the contract, as I read it, doesn't specify who conducts the lottery.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
Okay.
And
We do. Our enrollment office does, so I can
that's
clarify
fine.
that.
But I think specificity there
Yep.
is important. I kind of wanted to, I was thinking that we do do kind of these in order, so that's what I have on lottery. I mean, I can move on to another topic, or
Yeah, let's stay in lottery. That would be helpful if we could get through
Yeah.
lottery and then move on. Please.
What I was curious, and I just sent an email later today, so in regard to the 4K program, it's my understanding that if a student starts as a 4K student, then they would be exempt from the lottery and be a 5K student automatically, correct?
The statutory preference is for kids to continue in the school once they have attended the public school. So yeah, so you would expect that a 4K would proceed to 5K, would proceed to first grade and second grade without reapplying every year.
Okay, and that was my understanding too.
Yes.
So then, in regard to the 4K program, is the 4K program that would be offered at IMA Charter School going to be a full day or a half day 4K program?
So my understanding of this, and if I misspeak, certainly I will clarify, is that there are two components. There is the morning component, and which is the traditional, not traditional, but similar to our 4K program. It's not traditional because it's Montessori, but and then there is an afternoon component that is primarily grant funded. But that based on income, some students may have a fee to continue in the afternoon, which is not that different from some of our center-based 4K programs that currently exist, that they pay some fee for the wraparound portion of the 4K
Who
full
sets the
day.
fee?
So,
Right, and
so there
so
may be there would be an additional fee for folks if they
for
wanted to do
some
the full
families
day
is my
program.
understanding.
And so would that be different? I mean, what if families can't afford to pay that fee, but then the families that can afford to pay the fee would then be
Preference
a
for
legacy?
5K.
It almost kind of feels like you're paying a tuition for partial school year, and then you'll be tuition free the rest of your stay there.
So I think that is a fair question. I guess one of my wonderings is just, so our current program and all our building-based programs are half days, right? And then we have our community partner models, which are, you can go for part of the day. In fact, our contract says you can't require the family to attend the full day. But then the families that choose to attend the full day pay the fee. And so I guess I'm trying to figure out who would opt out based on that model.
I think
People
Anna,
can't afford it.
if I can, yeah, Anna's wondering who's being privileged by the 4K preference, which I think is a fair question for us to take into consideration. Right now, our 4K students don't necessarily attend, as
Full
we
day.
all know, the school that they end up going to school for elementary school, which, yeah.
The easy answer is who's being privileged are the ones who end up attending either partly or full day, the IMA 4K model. I can't speak as to who has the opportunity to attend full day. My understanding is there is state and grant funding for low-income families to have the full day without having to pay an additional cost, and that it would be a limited set based on income status that would have to pay the supplemental amount in the afternoon. But because we don't know who everybody is yet, I can't say numbers-wise who's impacted by that.
It's an important question.
You actually answered it. I should have let you finish. Sorry about that, but you answered it.
Just on the grant funding, it's a complex formulas based on family size and income and how many hours the students are in the program, and undocumented students are not eligible for the state funding. So we would be discriminating against undocumented students in this model, even if all students could receive it. Undocumented students can't.
Thank you.
Undocumented students do not qualify for the state child care and preschool grants. So that's a and I have to say also that if that is grant funded, then who collects those grants? And I don't see them as part of the budget. And these would be classrooms taught by MMSD teachers, rented by MMSD people, and someone else is collecting grant money to put children in these classrooms?
That's a question I can't answer that I'll have to go offline and answer for. No, it's a fair question.
I know. I mean,
I mean,
under what auspices can someone collect money to put children in our classrooms?
Yep.
I think that's a huge question. And that brings up to, I think that before anything goes anywhere, we need a contract with IMA Incorporated to review. Because there's at least 2 and maybe 3 big pieces here that depend on IMA Incorporated. One is that IMA Incorporated will be collecting tuition to place children in our classrooms. They will be giving us some of that tuition, but not all of it. 2 is that we will be subletting from IMA Incorporated, and the terms of that lease, I think, are important. And 3 is that there are a number of payments that IMA Incorporated are promised by IMA Charter School, but IMA Charter School can't promise for IMA Incorporated. There's fundraising promises, there's support promises, $60,000 to $120,000 a year, and then there's the payment for
3K.
for 3K, and apparently no payment for 4K. So I don't see how, there's 3 people at the table here, and we've got a contract between 2 of them. So I think that piece from IMA Incorporated and what that looks like, this contract doesn't work if that contract doesn't work.
This contract is non-binding on IMA
Incorporated.
and I understand your point.
And the model in this contract depends upon
Yep.
IMA Incorporated. So I think that, so I don't know if that can happen before the new
I'm
deadline.
just going to wiggle my nose and it'll be.
But and I think that needs some pretty significant review.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we discussed this earlier, right? And I share some concerns
Yep.
just around what the structure, bylaws, governing structure, relationship between IMA Inc. and IMAX
Yep.
Governance Council would be. So I'm not sure it's a.
Yeah, I can't commit IMA to come to the table, but I can commit to taking that notion and seeing where it gets us, and then we will be where we will be. But that suggestion makes sense to me, and I understand the basis for it.
Financial pathways
Yes.
involved.
Yeah.
Did that go in, I feel like that was into budget. Were there other questions around budget before we move forward on student performance?
So I have a comment around maybe the kind of renewal dash, I guess what you were discussing, stick test, which I think is, maybe I'm just saying back to you what you initiated this in your dialogue, but there were several clauses that in this that could trigger non-renewal or breach of contract, namely around student performance and fundraising. And there are 2 other, I think, important pieces that to me are around performance. One is around meeting the budget, so we don't actually have control over how the money is spent, but we're making up the difference, right? So we're making up any gap. And the second is around enrollment overall, and more specifically demographics of that enrollment. But I think we've talked a lot about what happens if we're over-enrolled, but we have not talked about what happens if we're under-enrolled, which is actually the more common kind of midterm experience that we've had. So Badger Rock is 60% enrolled right now, and it's a big financial burden for when we don't spread those fixed costs well. So I think I would love to see some language around what happens if we are under-enrolled and or the budget isn't what we expect. I don't know what the right way to incorporate that is. It sounds like you have some ideas, but those were two other important pieces.
Yep. I appreciate that.
I'm still wondering on I'm getting my head around the funding of special ed. It's funding of special ed aides, and I know they've changed it so that the aid sticks with the individual with disabilities. But I'm still curious if, for example, Medicaid gets cut, which it very well could, but the Title I funding. Now, who and the kid requires more services than the school has. Do we cover it? Do they cover it? Who covers that amount?
So we continue to be the LEA. The district, because this is an instrumentality school, it is our school.
That's what I thought. but I
We
wanna make
continue
sure.
to have the LEA obligations. And even if you look at the student transferable amount as it's set forth in the policy, some of the call-outs are flow-through dollars that follow the so special ed, while we have our general formula, those also can go up and down as the individualized needs of students wax and wane in any school year. And so, yes, ultimately we would be responsible, because ultimately we are responsible for providing an appropriate education to that student, regardless of which of our buildings that student sits his or her bottom in every day. But, you know, and I'm glad to hear that some of the SEA concerns have been, because, you know, I think that that's important to clarify that the role of the special ed assistant is to assist our students with disabilities as is appropriate in their IEP.
And may I ask one more question? On TJ's point on the undocumented, if it does discriminate against the undocumented, are we going against MMSD's charter non-discrimination policy?
So we've had discussions about this just with our general non-discrimination policy, and actually immigration status in and of itself is not a protected class, and that's because there are a number of federal grant programs and other programs that do use immigration status as a legal indicator. But as you know, under Plyler v.
Right.
Doe,
You can't.
we have an additional obligation to make
Correct.
public school available, and in fact, we do not ask immigration status, right, because of the chilling effect from
Right.
from the progeny of cases. And so we do everything in our practices to make programs available for all students regardless of status. It is not in and of itself discriminatory or in violation of our policy to implement federal law, but we have worked very hard through other programs to make those opportunities available without consideration of immigration status. I know that's probably one of those lawyer answers that I just said a lot without saying anything,
It
but-
worked just fine.
but that is our goal.
Since we moved on to budget, first off, I continue to have concerns about the staffing model and the lack of classroom aides. You know, the Montessori model is, you know, one lead teacher and one non-teaching aide for classes of 24 to 30 something, and there is budgeted 0 classroom aides, and I think that we're setting up our students for failure by putting them in that classroom. Additionally, for the budget, the January budget ran a 5-year deficit of $58,000. The May budget runs a 5-year deficit of $500,000. It is a much, much larger financial commitment from the district that's being asked. for a smaller school. I think that's a significant change since January, and one that, as a board, we need to reflect on seriously.
Just to add, I mean, it's not a net at year 5, so one could expect it would continue.
Yes, one would expect
It
that.
looks like it's starting to turn, but.
And actually, the other one, I think, went positive year 5, didn't it? I think January went positive to year 5.
I would be interested in the details as to how that change occurred.
I also share concerns around the staffing. If I look at the table correctly, it looks like they've allocated 1.2 SEAs for a total of 212 students in the 5th year. That again seems inadequate to me. I know I raised those concerns the last time this came out. I don't see how that would be sufficient to be educating a diverse student body. And my other question too is when we get back the information around whether we can do transportation or not, I think again we need to look at, going back to the tuition for 4K, what families are we privileging? Because if we're going to offer transportation to set families in that area, but not offer it to people that live outside of that area, then there could be families on the near west side that would like to attend if they had the opportunity. They would be eligible to, but you put a barrier in there around transportation. And I think these are some of the problems that we see with charter schools. There, although it's not overtly discriminatory, there are barriers that put in place that limit who can access these schools.
So the transportation zone is actually based on what was previously defined as the attendance area. And anyone, if we had gone with a more traditional attendance area, anyone residing outside that attendance area would be responsible for their own transportation also because of the internal transfer. That's true with kind of any internal transfer model. That is part of our internal transfer policy. So that's in line with our current internal transfer policy, that if you choose to attend a school, and so, yeah, I understand your point. I just wanted to kind of let you know where that thought process was that it was treating it as a more traditional attendance area, but instead of making it an eligibility criteria.
And I think what's important to note about that is when we look at our internal transfer data, it tends to be predominantly middle-class families that participate in the program. And I think one of the reasons is specifically around the transportation piece. And so I don't want to replicate something that's already an inequity in the school district. Mary?
On that subject, it seems to me that one of the benefits of the school in its location was its access to a fairly substantial population of low-income students. And so I have less concerns about the transportation being unintendedly a barrier for low-income students in other areas, as long as they're successful in drawing. My concern is somewhat the opposite, is how many of those students fall within the 1.5-mile area and therefore won't be covered with our transportation, because I think parents will find that a bigger hurdle if they can't put their kids on a bus.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I think we could look at that too, right? Like using that transportation area and kids who currently would be entitled to transportation to their attendance area school, but if they chose to attend IMA, would actually fall within the walk zone. So it would be like a loss of transportation instead of.
What
we
if?
could look at those
but what if
numbers.
it's a longer? So they wouldn't qualify for transportation within their local school, but in that case, maybe it's a much shorter distance.
Like a quarter of a mile instead
A quarter of a mile. But I would want to understand that it might actually be a benefit if you could offer the transportation to IMA that they wouldn't get to their local school, and in fact we're providing a better option. But I think it's a really I think we could meet a lot of the goals that have been set about a diverse student body if we understand exactly how it's going to play out and how parents will view those transportation options with the nearby neighborhoods. After we're finished with this, Anna, I wanted to speak to your point about the staffing structure, but I don't want to. I don't want to get off the transportation if we can try to wrap that up and move on then to something else.
I just want to get clarity from Dylan that the transportation issue in terms of the attendance area and where our obligations are is something that you're still getting figuring out from DPI. So you might come back to us and say that we have to offer transportation everywhere throughout the district.
So that will not be the answer because you
Okay.
don't have to offer transportation to charter schools, period.
But if we offered it some, then we would have to offer
Well,
it all. That
yes,
might, I mean,
okay,
that might be an answer.
Yes. The answer, right, because of transportation parity and, yes.
That we would have to offer anyone outside whatever walk zone we defined, we would have to offer. If
If
we
we
ever offered
choose
to any,
to-
we would have, that's a possibility. Let's hope that's not the case.
If we choose to offer it at all, we have to offer it to all outside a mile and a half. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, that's a possibility.
Theoretically, it's a possibility. I've been looking at it and don't know how strong of a possibility it
Okay.
is. But yes, this is the one caveat that we're still working with DPI on because I made it up.
And I just want to add that my understanding of the location, and I'm just kind of mentally picturing it, is that a good portion of the 1.5 mile is non-residential. Because you've got like MATC and you've got stuff that there's like, yeah, I mean, the
Yeah,
other
if you
side
kind of
is
go
like-
in
I
one
mean, I'm
way
not
of your
saying that- I'm
radius.
not saying all of it, but I'm saying that there's kind of like, there's like behind it is pretty much, is mostly non-residential. I mean, I just pointing that out just.
Yeah, I
to-
haven't done a little compass circle
Yeah, either
around
have I,
it,
but just kind of trying to do that. So just kind of adding that to, if we were to go
Thought
within the
process.
1.5 mile, it would only be really in like 2 directions, not 4.
Okay.
All right, Mary?
I take a little different view on the staffing, and not because I don't think the issues you bring up, Anna, are really legitimate, but one of the interests I have in the IMA model is because it is different, and that they have much more, it feels, inclusive classrooms, not only in terms of where the children are located, but in terms of even the teaching methods. And I guess I wouldn't have that as a barrier to signing the agreement with the provision, and I think we approve this, even though this was brought up before, with the provision that we're going to be looking at this. And so that one I don't see as a hurdle. I do care deeply about the demographics of the students. I would prefer to see something where we could hold them to a student body that looks like the district, both in terms of income, race, and disabilities. But if that's not the case, I think it has to be clear that the school will not continue over the long term unless they are meeting those, at least from a board perspective, because this is not a school that is targeted at a particular type of technology or something like that. I think it was very much had the board support because, in fact, it had shown success and had and was very much embraced by the people putting forward that they could be successful in educating students, which as a district we know we have to improve upon. So the demographic and the transportation that plays into that, and then secondly, I would say the budget issues, an ongoing $140,000 a year deficit is significant. And you, Kate, I think brings up a great point. You are 10 students short of that, and now you've just added another 50,000 or 70,000 onto that, and we've seen with Badger Rock what can happen with that.
Mary, I appreciate your comment because it's getting me to think in a new way regarding diversity and demographics. Well, disability status and race and ethnicity are per se protected classes. Socioeconomic status is not. And so it makes me want to go back and look at the Seattle PICS case and that case around the use of some demographic data. And I'll think about it, but just reframing that has been helpful, so thank you.
Yeah, and just to touch base on the budget, I understand it's an inclusive model, but just to give a real, like, practical example, and the reason I talk about it is because since MMSD is the LEA, that means we need to provide any services that they are unable to provide. So in the case of a student who may require a full-time SEA, one-on-one, there could be a variety of reasons. It's really not that rare, even in our school district. My son requires that. That would pull that one individual from the 211 other students. Now, if another student or any other students needed that support, then our district would be obligated to pay for those SEAs, and you know, that's $60,000 we're talking about in additional support. And so I just think that, and that doesn't include what we'd be talking about with related services. That would be upwards of, you're paying people, you know, they come with a hefty price tag if we're looking at occupational therapists, speech and language therapists, or they would be pulled out of our existing programs to serve the school. So I think being the LEA does present some financial challenges that you want to make sure the school is adequately staffed, because we will be paying that money on top of this budget. So
Would that most likely, if those students were at IMA, and they require heavy amounts of resources, would those resources generally follow those students? So if they weren't an IMA, they're going to be in another district school, and those same amount of resources would be required.
yeah, they would be taken out of other schools, though. I mean, the district would have to pay for it. But I guess what I'm saying is you wouldn't want to start a program that's understaffed because you're going to be adding additional money onto it.
And my feeling is once the students are in the district, those resources are going to be spent. And yeah, they will be pulled from another school if students with those needs are in IMA, but then they're not in another school. And it probably is different where it's not such a heavy amount of support that is needed. But I would imagine with the example that you gave, that the resources follow the students. Is that true, or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Just to weigh in on this piece, is I think there's two things. One is just to try and get a realistic picture of the budget and what it will look like in practice. But the other one is that the other thing that kind of needs to be added is that with a small school, as you pointed out in another topic, is that there's the inefficiencies, that there's not the one-on-one coverage. One-on-one coverage is one-on-one coverage wherever it is. Right. But there are places where, you know, kids who have, you know, who are in our other schools, it's, you know, one SEA supporting 2 or 3 kids. With a very small school with IMA, that it might be one SEA. They might be one-on-one, not because of the needs of the child, but rather just because of the way the staffing works out. And so I think that those inefficiencies also play into how this will play out. And, you know, small schools are really, really difficult. We're going to be talking about facilities later. And, you know, when our schools dip below 200, it's difficult to staff them with any kind of efficiency. And, you know, the IMA, the Montessori does have the multi-grade model, which creates some efficiencies, but with the special education staffing, we also lose some of that. My concerns about the staffing is not the special education assistants, but the lack of education assistants, not SEAs, but EAs, and how that relates to the Montessori model. Dylan included the Montessori model in the draft contract, and the draft budget doesn't match that model. And to me, that's a real problem when you're not matching your own model.
Yeah, and I want to be clear. I added that myself as an efficient way to try to summarize the Montessori model. We have a very long document, and I don't know if I sufficiently highlighted my choice to use that version with IMACS. So I do want to just be clear that I use that as a summary vehicle to summarize their program, not one that I lifted from their proposal. And so I'll double check with them on that.
So, and Anna, was that
We gotta get back to John. Sorry, John.
No, I don't have a comment, I just want to move us along.
Yeah.
Because we have a much bigger topic after this, and I want to let Dylan get the feedback.
So that gets to my thing, is that I'd actually just like to know, I supported IMA. We voted for it. I think we have to honor that vote. This is not about going back, but I also think that we should know about the changes in staffing and the changes in the budget, or any other changes that occurred between what we voted on and what we have in front of us. And that I think is not, it's not revisiting something that we already budgeted, that we already voted on.
Okay.
May I just make a point for ask a question of clarification? Because I wasn't on the board at the time, I just want to make clear. Actually, the question is this: did we accept Montessori as a charter school?
Yes.
Fully? Yes.
Yes.
So it's just about approving the contract.
Yes.
That's all I needed to know, just to make sure.
The board accepted Montessori on the condition that certain supplemental things met standards. And I think it is at the time, and the board at the time said that it would, that administrative staff could decide whether they met standards or not. At the time, I objected to that and said I think it's the board's job to decide whether they meet standards or not, and I still believe that. I think that, you know, that $450,000 change in budget is how that is an improvement. I have no idea. So I would respectfully disagree with the characterization of what the board did in January.
TJ, I'm with you on the budget. I think that's a significant difference in change of proposal, as would, I think, significant changes in staffing. And I agree that it was, certainly we had issues that needed to be worked out in the contract. But I think that the school was approved as a charter school with the provisions of certain things being worked out in the contract. But yeah, I mean, that's what we have. But I don't think we did not approve. But we approved the school, you know. And so I think we have the responsibility to get this done. And I think the administration has the responsibility to bring to us a contract that reflects basically what the board approved, and to highlight any changes or address any issues that the board had surfaced at that point.
And just as a reminder to the board, the grid that is in your packet includes the 4 contingency areas, the team's analysis on the supplementary materials that were given to us, which we worked very closely with IMA on. I mean, we didn't just receive them. We are, the board's approval of the charter, IMA is our school. And so we've been working really closely with them to make sure that these expectations are met. So I would ask you to just reference that chart, which does go through some of the changes in the budget, for example. But we'll make sure to brief anyone who wants additional information on any of those items, which we do believe now meets our expectations. I think if there's any final feedback, Anna, this would be the time to get it. Thanks.
Just 2 quick things, and these are things Dylan and I met earlier today, and so I'm not going to go into real detail on them. One of them is that some clarity around waivers, that there's no waivers listed here. There were previously listed, and I have concerns about physical education, certification requirements, and workload requirements with teachers, and in general, employee handbook requirements, and again, with the staffing and schedule, how those are met. So those are, and then the other thing is that On the fundraising and kind of more generally, the issues that Kate brought up about, what are, how these play out over the years, the current fundraising is that if the fundraising and other financials aren't met for 2 years consecutively, my preference would be for 1 year that this could be considered to be good cause, and not necessarily, not an automatic breach of contract, but could be considered as good cause to break the contract. I mean, nobody breaks contract, nobody does that lightly. Certainly, I would that would be my preference. I would strongly object to the consecutive years, because you can manipulate your finances in ways that you don't do consecutive years and yet still run huge deficits every other year. Just adding those.
Any other comments? I would entertain a motion to adjourn. Okay. Moved and seconded. Your advisory vote?
Aye.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Send me update.
We are adjourned.
It wasn't in the notice material.
No, I didn't see it. Not that.
No, it was weekly updates.
It was in the weekly update.
Update like 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
I didn't realize it was in it.
I didn't see that.
I'm just gonna quick use that.
Okay, come back as quick as you can.
Okay, you guys were only 5 minutes. Yeah.
Or we're taking a break.
I thought Mary was, it was like, no more.
of the Operations Work Group on July 10th, 2017. And we will be starting with public appearances, and we have one public appearance. Kristen Nelson already here. And Kristen, you know the drill. We have 3 minutes, so start whenever you want.
So I'm sort of tying your last meeting and your next meeting together through equity. I did draw the 1.5-mile circle around the school. It looks like we're not going to bus Northport, Brentwood, or Packers Ave, but we will bus the families around Cherokee Country Club and Maple Bluff Country Club. And the appearance of that, I feel, would not be great if equity is one of our driving forces. And also, if you go to the school, it's on Packers in Northport. And I don't know a lot of people that will send their 5-year-old across 6 lanes of traffic, regardless if, I won't even bike on that road, although Mary knows I'm not a very good biker. But I just feel like, is there flexibility? Jill was mentioning some of the Minota kids do get on a bus route because they would have to cross the road. Could we have stops at Northport, Brentwood, and Packers Ave at the very least? I don't know what kind of legal flexibility that you would have, but I feel like parents aren't going to even enroll in the lottery if they think they have to, if there's no transportation. My oldest kid goes to Shabazz, so I'm a big fan of alternative education, but Shabazz does not reflect the diversity of our district in any way. There's a lot of reasons for that, but transportation is one of them. I can drop my kid off, she can walk, so I'm not a good example, but transportation is a huge boulder in getting our programs for everyone. And we've seen in the Pathways program, when we offer it at a school, we can get diverse enrollments for creative programs when transportation isn't an issue. So do you have flexibility with transportation for this and any other program you do so that everyone can get there? That's all. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. Okay. Next on the agenda is approval of the minutes dated for the work group meeting dated May 8th. Is there a motion for approval?
So moved.
A second?
Second.
Okay. Morton, your advisory vote?
Aye.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? That passes 5-0. Okay. And then on to our long-range facility plan update. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to the superintendent.
All right, thank you, Mary. So I want to take you back in time, way back to shortly after I started, actually, my first year. One of our very first board retreats, might have been our second one, where we had a discussion about facilities. And it was at that meeting, I know, are you remembering this, Mike? At that meeting, we talked about the importance of having a short-term solution. There were some things that we just needed to address immediately. And we needed to have a long-term solution. We needed to have a long-range facilities plan that would help us make sure that our facilities reflect the value that we place in our students and the important work our teachers do with our students. On the short-term side, we, not too long after that meeting, put together a package and passed a facilities referendum. All of those projects will be completed by the end of the summer, so we have stayed true to our promise to get some of those immediate problems addressed through the short-term facilities plan, and we have been working on the development of a long-range facilities plan. I think the first discussion we had with the board at length about what that could look like was back in October of 2015. Last summer, we brought the board a kind of a first chunk of information on growth projections, which we'll reference a little bit tonight, just as a reminder. And then in winter, this past winter, we brought you some updated information on the quality of our facilities. Along the way, we also gave you some information, Beth provided it, on input that we'd received from our community about what they would like to see happen with our facilities. So today we're going to, especially with a couple of new board members with us, we want to recap all that we've done in the last couple of years. But most important, we want to lay out a plan for the future, which we're really excited about. We think this is incredibly important work. We think this is incredibly important board work. and are looking for your guidance on strategy tonight. You won't be making any decisions. If we were to move forward as our plan, as you'll see tonight, the first set of like voting decisions wouldn't be made by the board until the second half of the school year. But we certainly need your guidance on strategy. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Mike. Mike is joined by Chad Weezy, our head of facilities. So I'm not sure if everyone has met Chad before. You've definitely met Mike, I think, at this point. And he's also joined by Beth Bade, who leads the qualitative research in our research department, but has her hands, I think, on almost everything that comes out of that group. So, Mike, take it away.
We used to call our facility planning team Guys with Ties, but with the important addition of Beth,
Thank
we
goodness.
have moved beyond the Guys with Ties designation. We are also, as you know, missing Dean and James tonight. And so we're going to offer both of those board members an individual, kind of a one-on-one little catch-up meeting if they're interested. And since we have new board members who are not part of these previous talks, we would extend the same invitation to you, and we'll follow up through email and see what your interest in that might be. Okay? So there are a couple of pauses. Thank you, Barb. There are a couple of, based on the comments that Jen made, we're going to pause at the end of the work we have done to date. We really want to focus in on our recommended solution around maintenance planning. There's a pause there. And then, obviously, the major capital improvement plan. There's a lot of input we're going to be seeking there. Okay? So we're going to try to go more quickly, I think, through the opening piece, and then it'll slow down a little bit. So we're thinking that we don't necessarily have to spend a lot of time tonight building the case for a consistent and intentional approach to facility and capital needs. We want to just review the highlights here. Obviously, health, safety, and welfare of the students and staff is our core responsibility. Minimizing operational distractions, supporting instructions. Parents and students expected clearly. Enrollment is impacted. There's a plus or a minus sign there. There could also be a dollar sign there, now that I think of it. Reinvesting in facilities, good stewardship, and one thing something that one board passes along to successor boards. And our local context, size, and age of the plant require this kind of planning. We have 52 facilities, and they average 53 years of age, and that is a big deal when your age of plant is that advanced. And 4.5 million square feet. So those are some of the reasons for our push for a consistent and intentional approach to planning. It sounds so common sense, but it's not necessarily that easy to do. Things like the Great Recession. And no one was out there promoting bond referendums for schools from 2008 until about 2013, 14. It was very difficult to do. And for good reason. People are really struggling financially. Wisconsin school funding generally makes these things difficult to do as well. And then also the long time period, 4, 8, 12-year cycles, during which time board members change, leadership changes, and just hard to gain and keep a consistent approach. We think we can do it if we start building in some structure. Okay? That's the point. And this is what we're talking about, a cyclical process to proactively identify and prioritize facility needs. And the key, matched with a funding source. You do not need a list from us of all of our woes. Right? You need a solution on how we're going to address it. And that's really what we want to get to. Higher expectations and a consistent way of working. We think we made some inroads on higher expectations when we took on projects like Mendota Elementary, the learning conditions at Jefferson, even the East Theater. There's things that were clearly not to our standard, but had become part of the way it is. And challenging the way it is an important part of this work. And then lastly, organizing all the data in an online resource to improve transparency, accountability, continuity. In other words, this is not a project. This is not a one-off. That website should live, it should be continuous. And we have a good model to use in that the City of Madison has a really nice capital planning website. You can go back 5, 10, 15 years and look what they've done. And you can go forward 5, 8, 9, 10 years and see what they're planning. We'd like to get to that. That's a good example of how you can create structures that last, right, that stick. I want to kind of cover a little bit of review work here on 3 major sections. Essentially, the Van de Waal report on population growth in the City of Madison School District of Madison, our assessment of existing facilities, and our engagement. Okay? So I'll go quickly because you've seen this before. What do the projections tell us? This is key for long-range planning. We will have enrollment growth that will be slight and gradual over the long term. Right? There will be hotspots associated with that, and we'll get into that a little bit. But overall, slight and gradual enrollment increase. School-specific enrollments will be relatively stable. We do not see any existing school where we can say this school is slated for closure, okay, for example. So maintaining what we have is going to be important, and targeted solutions where needed. And then lastly, the community will change over the next 20 years. It always does. And the demographics will change as well. And it looks like an increase in ELL student population. Currently, we have about 7,500 students that would be considered ELL. 14% means about 8,500 students would fall into that category. Increase of students of color. No change overall in low-income students. Now, be aware, this is a demographic projection over 20 years. You have to take it for what it's an inference of what may happen in Madison. And you have to discount it heavily for that. So that's the community growth. Public engagement. Beth?
So all through this process, we've been working to gather opinions of people throughout Madison about where we should be headed with our facilities and current concerns and future conditions. So as we talked about last time, there's a few themes that just run through this work throughout. First is really that it's about school culture, climate, and learning. It's not about the bricks and mortar of the building. It's about creating a space and an environment that enhances student learning and makes it a place people want to go to work every day. What we've heard from people is that substandard facility conditions do not make staff and students feel valued, and they don't mirror the high expectations that we have for them. They can be internalizing messages on their own. We've also heard that those substandard conditions are not welcoming to the community, and they can detract from our reputation. So as we're out there, we want to be putting our best foot forward, and our facilities are a part of that process. So maintaining facilities and keeping them safe really is a top priority, and people believe that's what we should be doing. We've been kindly referring to this message as the Eat Your Vegetables message. This is, we need to do the things we need to do to keep people feeling valued in our buildings and to keep student learning at the forefront. So what this has done over time, it's given us kind of these main messages, and we've used all this input to create one product which we call the set of guiding principles. This was a draft that we brought back in January, and we used this spring to take it out, refine it with more feedback, get input on it, and come up really with 6 principles in no particular order that help guide our future work. Prioritizing the health, safety, and accessibility, promoting academic and co-curricular excellence, adequately and consistently investing in our facilities, treating the buildings as community hubs and not just schools, keeping equity at the forefront of all the decision making, and then really demonstrating a strategic approach to facility investments. So our goal with these principles is really that they stand as a document to help guide decisions, technical, and some of these sort of more improvement-based concepts moving forward.
Thank you, Beth. So if you were to check out our online resource, which is referenced on this slide, you will see the community growth study. You'll see the in-depth, the facility assessment tools. You'll see the public engagement responses, including this report from PRA. So Chad, you want to walk us through this piece?
Yeah, and I encourage you enough to take a look at that online resource if you can. The Tableau piece Bo put together that he turned the PRA report into an interactive tool. We've been contacted by districts around the country asking how we did it, so it's really worth taking a look at. So the final piece of the foundational work we did to get to here tonight was we actually assessed all of our sites, and that included all of our school sites, Doyle and Hoyt, and worked with Plunkett Rayford and Rettler. And Rettler came on to look at our athletics facilities, and they partnered with our building services team and actually used a lot of the resources we have to track the existing condition of our sites and put together a facilities condition letter grade and a range and a variety of recommendations and costs for improvements related to those grades. Gave a low-end price tag to get all of our facilities to a C from their current condition of around $220 million. And to get, and if you read the report, to get to a B was somewhere in the neighborhood of $490 million. So there's plenty of work to do, and like Mike said to start, we're not here to point out issues, but come up with a plan to get us on the right path.
So the way we looked at it is that the Vanderwall community study is really kind of about the demand, and the facility assessment is really about your supply, and how do those two line up. If the $220 million number, it's interesting. If that gives you sticker shock, stop and think. 52 separate facilities make up that number, and they are older facilities, average of 53 years of age. The high schools alone need substantial upkeep, right? They're great, iconic structures, but they also need a lot of upkeep. So while that number at first is kind of like, wow, remember, we didn't get into this position overnight, nor are we proposing to solve it overnight. We're proposing a steady pattern of investment to get the facilities to where we want them to be. So, so that's our supply analysis, and we've often expressed it this way. This is our periodic table of facility conditions.
So as a reminder, we started this 5 or 6 years back with a study that Durant did and kept this going just so we had some consistency. But we also added some new categories for us to track, and we'll continue to track them as we refresh this report. So there were things added like aesthetics, energy and energy conservation, technology infrastructure, interior finishes, that PRA did a little additional work on their end. So we had just some more baseline data to track around the needs of our facilities and put together a report. And like I said, you can certainly look at the 250-page report PRA did, or feel free to use the online tool that can walk you through each individual site with a decent amount of detail.
So we're going to pause there just for a minute and ask if there are any questions or clarifying questions about what we've done to date in terms of establishing the demand and assessing our supply of facilities. If not, we're going to keep rolling. Okay, well, let's keep rolling. So, of course, we have, this is challenging work, but we also have some really positive sort of off-balance sheet assets working for us as we approach this work. And a lot of this is really just attributable to the Madison context. First, a really low level of existing debt. There are cycles and stages to this work where communities go through building cycles when they are new, like suburban Dane County, or more established communities like Madison. And then there's a reinvestment cycle. And we're sort of transitioning from a period of amazingly stable conditions. There's been only 2 major facility projects in the district since 1990. Chavez and Olson, right? 1990 and 2005. That's, think about it, 27 years now. But the the peaceful and quiet past does not necessarily mean the next 27 years are going to be the same, because, obviously conditions change. Super strong local economy. All the planners are really bullish on Madison as a city, as a region. That's a great asset to have. Large and growing tax base is obviously related to that. Slow to moderate enrollment growth. The third bullet and the fourth bullet work together and create an unusual and super positive condition. A large and growing tax base with slow to moderate enrollment growth. That means that your facility needs don't necessarily need to be aimed at additional square footage for surging enrollment, which is a problem that other districts might have. That's not our case. Our large and growing tax base can be used to support our existing infrastructure and those hot spots where it might be needed. It's rare, and it's super positive. You usually don't see major tax base growth without major enrollment growth. Positive community support that's been demonstrated in 2 prior referenda in the last couple of years, one on operating budget, one on facilities. And of course, there's a real attachment in the community to schools, school identity. I live in the LVM neighborhood. You'll hear people say, it's just it's part of the fabric of the community. So they're really positive conditions. So let's start talking about some solutions here. We're going to break this into 2 different types of solutions. First, the capital maintenance plan. Maintenance, meaning roofs, boilers, window systems, keeping the existing schools up and running and keeping them in great shape, right? As opposed to improvement plans. Improvement plans would be your new schools, your major change of direction. The third category, routine maintenance, fixing things that are broken, and that's just regular operating budget. We're not dealing with that tonight. Okay? So maintenance. This is our strategy around capital maintenance. We have been underfunded for a significant number of years. Okay? You got to know that. Our operating budget is nowhere near what it needs to be. There was a study done. You referenced the Durant study. There was a panel, community panel that reviewed that work, reported to the board, and said your funding level on maintenance should be about $8 million a year. And that was several years ago.
$2 a square foot.
$2, yeah, we're not there. We've never been there. And I think that report was submitted about a week before Act 10. So very difficult to make major changes in the how the underlying MMSD budget is allocated under those conditions. Here's our strategy. Reallocate dollars within the operating budget. We have to show effort here, and we have to have the discipline to do that. Combine that with new short-term notes on a recurring 4-year cycle. Those 2 actions together provide $10 million per year for capital maintenance. We think that level aligns with operational capacity, like how much the department can take on realistically, and levy capacity. How much money can you put on the local levy before you've gone too far? What can the community reasonably support? The short cycling of notes minimizes interest expense. And we would recommend starting this cycle in 2020. It allows us time to build up our operating budget and time for our tax base to grow, time for the additional levy authority that was just earned to play out, so we're not stacking those on top of each other. Closer to where the debt naturally decreases. There's a lot of reasons for starting in 2020. At the bottom, it's hard to see there, but that's the model. Operating budget in a 4-year window of $40 million would contribute $14 million, and notes would contribute $26 million. Combined, $40 million. And at that level, if you're consistently investing $10 million a year, we can make significant inroads into our CMP. What do we spend to that? How do we prioritize capital maintenance needs? Chad, you want to talk this through? This
Sure.
is a model.
Yeah. So like Mike said, this is a model, and I think once we got to a consistent funding stream like this, that's when the real work around planning and where to allocate those resources would go. And this is just one way to take a look at it. in our meetings behind the scenes have referred to the blue side of that pie as the Rick Hopke list. And if you know Rick, Rick's been around for a few decades now, and he's the assistant director in charge of maintenance. And if Rick had his way, we'd put all the money towards the capital maintenance work to roofs and boilers and windows. But we also know that there are other needs around the district that can be addressed through capital maintenance money. And those may include instructional needs, so that the old science teacher in me, in room 327 at East High School, if I heard that there was potential of more money being spent to maintain our facilities, I don't care about the roofs and the boilers, redo my science lab. And the same could be said for the old football coach in me. What? There could be some more money to maintain athletics facilities. Have you seen my weight room lately? Or have you considered sport turf for the football field? And I think the idea is to give a little piece of the pie to all the folks and and certainly all the facilities. So heading in a direction of spending $24 million or so on general maintenance needs, kind of that Rick Hopke list. Another $10 million or so on the instructional needs, and we'd have lots of planning that have to go along with that, and then $6 million towards athletics.
Chad's really conflicted, as you can hear.
Not really.
I'm not. Yeah, there's plenty of needs, so it wouldn't be an issue.
This is a model. We think reaction over time from the board about this balance of interest would be welcomed by us. This was our take on it.
Without a doubt.
We ran several of these. We thought this was a good model. It's clearly not the only one. A couple. Pause here.
Do you want to pause here, or it's up to you? It's up to somebody.
Can you give us a couple more slides, TJ? And
Yeah, just let me just. Yeah, I'll 3 more slides and we'll do it. And these will go quickly. This is the outstanding debt as a percentage of property valuation. So your debt obligations divided by the total property tax base of your school district. And this is expressed in relative terms. You can see in the upper right, there's a little Baird logo. This came from Baird. They have obviously more comparative data than we have access to. So you can take a community that's growing very rapidly and trying to build to catch up, which would be Sun Prairie is a good example of that. That's the one on top, where their percentage of debt to property value is considerably higher than the other major districts in the state. Madison Metropolitan is down one from the bottom, and again, that reflects a couple things. We haven't built a lot, and we have a very high tax base per pupil. So that is a positive condition. Doesn't mean these facilities are free. I don't want to fool anybody. But it does mean that from a balance sheet perspective, we can support a reasonable amount of debt, and be, especially relative to these other school districts. This is the same data, essentially just in table form. The district is debt-free in 2026. Given the size of the district, this is, again, not a lot of existing debt. And then lastly, this is shown graphically. And so if we try to think about how to pace this work, you look for opportunities where existing debt is dropping off. And that's, as you can see in the middle, 5 years out, and then again, 4 years beyond that. And you kind of wrap around financing. So we'll pause there for questions about CMP. This is the area we really want to focus on. So we'll pause here.
A couple questions, couple comments. The 3.5 million projected in here from operating budget, what would you classify as CMP lately? What have we, I mean, I know we've been doing, between 4 and 6 million in maintenance, but that's a larger category than this.
I'll give you the financial answer, and then Chad.
I've got projects this summer I consider
reality
CMP work, sure.
You're looking at Fund 41, which is called capital maintenance, and you've seen it funded anywhere from 4.5 to 6 million. And it creates this sense that that's what our discretionary project money is, but it's not really that simple. A couple $1 million of that money pays for labor for the tradesmen that work here, the pipe fitters and the electricians. So that's not really building, replacing a roof. The money's not available for that. It's paying for labor. And then secondly, a chunk of that money goes for routine break it, fix it, general maintenance. So our rough estimate is that the amount of money that's been available for these types of projects, like you saw on the screen, we want to remodel a library type of projects, $1.5 million a year for the last few years. And the TID money will help that a little bit going forward.
Yeah, so we did have a splash of TID money this year that helped us. This summer, just off the top of my head, roof at Hegel, boiler replacement at Randall, a few gym floors, a pretty substantial HVAC project at La Follette, and a half a dozen parking lots around the district. Some of them small enough that they're $30,000, $40,000, but that was really the pot of money left for any type of work like that wasn't break it, fix it, and we did it this summer.
You mentioned Fund 41. I take it most is to go through Fund 41, and because of that, what kind of impacts would going for $26 million bonding, approximately $6.5 million in bonding spending a year, have on our equalization aid?
So, I mentioned earlier, one of the things that's a barrier for us when we talk about these kind of funding solutions is that to the extent that we increase our spending per pupil, our shared cost per pupil, it has a negative impact on our equalization aid. When we did the $41 million referendum in April of 15, we put it on the slide and showed this is the impact. So we have to be aware of that. The potential antidote to that is the tax base growth. And you're kind of in a race there between how fast can the tax base grow versus what is the impact of shared costs per pupil. It is a condition we have to allow for. We have to make sure that in our planning that we anticipate that. This has to be financially viable plan, and equalization aid is a key part of that.
Mike, would it be all right? Go back to the facilities referendum, the set of projects we're almost finished with, and this may be for you, Chad. Would you categorize that set of projects as mainly CMP maintenance projects? So Hegel, Mendota, the accessibility projects.
Yeah, we had that discussion.
Yeah.
I think where it starts to get a little bit gray would be like the East Auditorium.
Yeah.
Was
that might have been an improvement
Yeah,
project.
that was. We weren't maintaining the existing space. We were vastly improving that space.
Yeah.
So I think in many cases those could be considered smaller projects that we could incorporate into maintenance work.
I think it might be
with a budget like this, you could take on a $1 million accessibility project at an individual site because we'd have money budgeted for it. Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's helpful because if we think about mainly this last package of being a CMP package, capital maintenance projects, it helps us envision the kinds of sets of projects we'd be bringing forward every 4 years, which is quite different from building a new school.
Yeah. In fact,
Nikki?
the fact that it was $41 million and we're
Yeah.
proposing $40 million
It's not by
cycles.
accident.
You had
That
like
was
3
essentially the first
questions.
cycle.
We're going to, Nikki?
Quick question. I know this expenditure covers things like solar panels. It covers possibly air conditioning and those kind of things. Doesn't the lead pipes, does that come out of something else? Does that come out of here? Where does that come out of?
We have very few lead pipes in our district. We actually just have a few
lead in the water.
fixtures. Yeah, the lead in the water is being taken out
That's
of
what I
our
meant.
general maintenance budget right now.
That's what I meant.
We're going to have that baby buttoned up by this August
Nice.
with a bow on it. Yep, done by this August.
Done. Okay, Kate.
So you asked for feedback on kind of the ratio here in this pie chart and this capital maintenance plan. For me, that ratio really depends on something else, which is these are all, and maybe I'm so excited about this conversation just overall. So, I'm thrilled to be having this conversation. It really, I know. But for me, it really depends on what we talk about with our improvement plans and how aggressive we want to get there. So, you know, if we're maybe instead of improving older facilities, but rather replacing, not
Right.
even just building for new growth, but replacing facilities, I think it changes the dial on those boilers and AC and roofs, right? So maybe just to say that and then
Yes.
have the more important conversation
Sure.
separately. And maybe just to say back to you what I think the going in thought here on the math was, which was what I just heard you say, $1.5 million that we've been spending is kind of CMP, another 4-ish on routine maintenance,
And labor.
and an incremental 5-ish a year. That's just 220 million divided by 10. So 10 total would inclusive, maybe that's not inclusive. I'm just trying to get a scale of what we're talking about math-wise on an annual basis, what your thinking is. So I didn't know if you were thinking about that as inclusive or not. Does that question make sense?
Yeah.
It's not super important. I just thought it would be helpful as like a bar chart of total maintenance, total facility spend. What's routine maintenance, what's sort of in the middle, and what's
Okay. Yeah.
projects.
I would
That'd
actually
be great to
like to
show
make
it
that
to
chart.
them.
I think it might be
I would
helpful.
like it if you.
Very fun.
Thank you.
Sketch it out for us on a piece
Yes.
of paper.
Yes.
Not having a whiteboard to draw on here really is
Right.
challenging for me.
Very life.
Yeah.
Anna, did you
Very good.
have anything? No, TJ, so back to TJ.
Sorry. So as with and without referendum for that, with or without the facilities referendum, kind of for what Kate asked for. Just a couple of quick comments. One is in terms of the priorities. I mean, these look fine, and that I think that one of the things is that the communication about the priorities, how they've been set, what they are, and what it means to say something's a priority, because one thing's going to come before another one. That's what real priorities are. And I think that as we get closer to asking for voters, the more specific we can to say, this is what 2022 looks like. These
We
are the
just had that
projects.
conversation.
I think that's got to go a long way. Some things that I don't know whether these are CMP or capital or the other ones, but things that I think I see 4K mentioned here. Fully integrating 4K into all facilities planning is something that I think is, we're doing better than we have been, but I think it's long overdue. That includes attendance area, school capacity, and any kind of spending we're doing here. And also will make the push for meeting space and long and short-term rentals that we use, that if we can use our own facilities for that annually instead of renting from other people for meeting space that we use, at hotels in Edgewood and here and there, but also for, programs we have on Olin Avenue, the programs we have, all those things, the more we can plan to use our buildings. And someone said that we don't have any buildings that are on the borderline of closure. I'm not going to mention any, but there are a few areas where I believe, at least 2 areas in the district where I think that geographically we are over capacity and under enrolled, and projections don't show much change there. And I think that both of those, that before we go to the voters, we need to have for anything related to facilities, we need to have a very, very thorough discussion of Kate mentioned, of closing and/or redrawing districts or doing something to use them. The inefficiencies aren't just having a building there, but it's also because of class sizes and things like that. Inefficiencies come up. So I think that that we have 2 or 3 schools that are dangerously small, and we have at least kind of 2 geographic areas where I think that we're that our capacity greatly exceeds our enrollment and our projected enrollment. So, and I'm not going to get in trouble by naming those areas. We can do that later.
One last quick comment is at one of our last meetings, actually I think it was a potential board amendment on air conditioning. I just want to remind everyone that this is where things like air conditioning projects would land in the CMP budget.
Actually, I had a comment, and it affects both the CMP but also the improvements as well. And you can't not be for this stuff, right? I mean, who doesn't want safe, well-ventilated, attractive, comfortable buildings? But I looked at some of the data with regards to how our student performance has been in some of our newest schools. And if you look at Olson and Chavez, our new schools, you don't necessarily see a strong correlation that having bright, shiny, new classrooms necessarily leads to high student performance. And in fact, I think they fall below the line for what you would expect with regards to the scores for, given the low level of low-income students in there. And I think that we need to have this discussion as part of our overall discussion of how we are going to have a great school district where our kids are thriving, where we attract and keep the best teachers. And I'm not denying that it's part of it, but I also think that this is a resource question. And I don't think that we should be talking about, just as I said when we should be talking about class sizes, that we can't be talking about it outside of what we believe fundamentally drives student performance. And that that's a wide range. I wouldn't ever say it's one MAP scores or anything like that. And our teachers and their abilities to do their jobs well. And so I'd like to make sure that that is part of how we look at this in a long-term way, and that we've talked about the relationship between teachers and students in the classroom. And my guess is if you asked parents, the vast majority of parents would give up the shiny new for the best teacher that school had. And so I hope that we have this as part of our comprehensive discussion and our long-term plan, because while it's necessary and it's great, and we do have a great opportunity with a rising tax base here in Madison and low debt levels, it's not actually the answer to the major issues that we are facing.
I agree with some of what you said, Mary, but I also agree on teacher morale is at an all-time low. The reason I bring up the air conditioning is it for luxury. I am worried about people's health. I am worried about especially disabled students who overheat easily, especially those in wheelchairs. And I'm afraid of what that might cost us if we don't make those kind of accommodations now while we still can. But I agree, we have to look at everything in the totality.
Yeah.
So I think we need to keep that in mind, that these things contribute to teacher and student improvement, yes. But at the same point, I didn't say fund every single project, but I think we need to be wary that by not funding some of them, we may end up with worse financial issues regarding them later.
And Nikki, I actually think that what you said actually is coincides with exactly what I was saying, because what I meant is if you have at the heart of it the thing between the teachers and the students, and that's what's at the heart of learning, that's exactly, so when you start prioritizing, to TJ's point, what are the things that impact that type of, that relationship between the student and the teacher, the teachers and their, how they feel about coming to work every single day, about students learning. So yes, that's exactly, I think, what I was trying to say. Let's talk about what's really at the foundational aspect of student learning, and I think that is so closely tied with teacher morale.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd add one last comment about that, just because we've discussed this for hours and hours. Often what presents symptomatically as a maintenance problem is really a funding problem. The funding problem is really a planning problem. And the planning problem is really because there's a lack of clarity around beliefs. So we get the holistic argument that you're making. We totally support it. We're thinking, I think this may be part of Nikki's point, is that within that holistic belief system, health, safety, welfare, minimizing distractions, all those issues should surface there, and hopefully lead logically to what we're proposing, and hopefully that will come out in future discussions, if not tonight.
And Mike, not to belabor the point, although I guess I am, and I'll just take, since I'm chairing the meeting, I can do that. Is that we can. I will push on this a little, because there's the holistic and the feeling that it is, but what I'm asking as a board member is that it's far more intentional than that, because of resource prioritization, because we have a long way to go, and when we're talking about these dollars, it's that's what I firmly believe, if we're going to really make the progress. And I've been on the board too long, frankly, to not start pushing on these things to say, well, exactly how is this going to help us in the objectives that we know we have heard from the community that we need to do.
Before we go on, I think that discussion will be especially important maybe in the CIP discussion we'll be having in a minute. But what we just talked about is like the eat your vegetables part of facilities maintenance, which I don't think we would ever argue that. I mean, I really get your point. I'm struggling with how to articulate what's in my head, but that having clean, safe, like minimally clean, safe
Dry
schools are going to improve student achievement, right? It's always about, at the end of the day, about the relationship between the teacher and the child in the classroom. We know that is front and center, but we do think it's fundamental. Like, you have to eat your vegetables. You have to have safe, well-kept schools. We're not talking about. I was going to name some of the fancy schools in nearby districts. I won't do that. But
well, I mean,
right,
but why don't you change? But I'll look at one. I mean, Alice is on the list of having, and Alice has issues. But I also spend quite a bit of time in Alice tutoring on a weekly basis. And we've certainly done some improvements there, and I'm not arguing against safe environments, but I guess when you're talking about the amount of money that we're talking about, I think, and whether this is it's the 40 million, or is that the scope of what, or is it the 220 million?
Our plan is to approach this in $40 million 4-year segments, of which $14 million would be funded by our regular operating budget, and 26 would be new, or a special referendum funded type of solution.
So I think we all understand where, but I guess there's, when you talk about a fundamental spending level that's is quite a bit in excess of where we are at. I think we are talking about additional spending, and whether.
And you want to know what the return on investment will be.
That's how it makes it to me sound so business-like. I mean, I just.
I think it's maybe a good time to segue into the next discussion, because that's, I think, more getting.
Well, since I'm not running the meeting,
Yeah.
I will not belabor this.
Thank
All
you.
right. So let's move on to a solution around capital improvement plan, or really a plan to have a plan around capital improvement. And I'll let Beth walk you through this piece.
Yeah, I was given the slightly more exciting topic, so that's pretty good stuff here. So I'm going to walk you a little bit through our thinking on the capital improvement planning process, and I'll just emphasize at the start, we're talking right now about the strategy towards this. We'll give a couple examples, but it's more about the process and the way of working around this than any specific project at this point. So capital improvement planning is really about projects that are major new construction, major renovations, things that we can't take on through routine maintenance or the maintenance plan. Would be the use of long-term bonds to take that work on. Things like major changes in school configuration may also play into this. And really, putting this planning process together around the CIP is about developing the criteria for choosing projects. It's about identifying and prioritizing those needs that are hopefully going to get us the best levers for student success. So a couple examples of CIP type issues. We've talked about these when we were here in January a bit. So Nuestro Mundo, we're on a lease right now with that building, trying to find a long-term solution for that facility. Second example is the growth on the Far East Side. So we own property on Sprecher Road, when to do construction in that space. The third is really around the growth on the Far West Side, particularly that Vanderwall has kind of outlined for us. So you're looking in that Olson Elementary area, dealing with the influx of new students and what that may mean all along the way K-12. Another example is Leopold, so that whole Fitchburg area, and just an elementary of that size. Is that the right way to configure the school, and would we want another way to deal with that? So, and there's plenty more examples beyond those.
Yeah, there really are. We could mention alternative school sites. In this example, more so than a maintenance example, neighborhood schools, paired schools. There's these are up here just as examples. So if you are a member of the Nuestro Mundo community, I don't want anyone to get overly excited in a positive or negative way. The same would go for Leopold. These are here as to show you the type of scale of project as opposed to a roof or a boiler job.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
There's nothing special about these particular items listed that are examples.
So what we've been working on is thinking through this criteria concept. So we need a way to set the criteria for determining which projects to prioritize at what time. So what we've done is create a set of criteria that we're sharing with you that are really brought together through a variety of sources, but two to highlight for you is around the guiding principles that we talked about earlier, that community voice, as well as looking at best practices nationwide for looking for other sets of criteria and how they're operationalized in other districts. So we could use your feedback today, but especially we'll share the document with you, and moving forward over the course of the next month or so is thinking about these criteria and how we've operationalized them so we can refine that moving forward. So, yeah, that just looks brutal on this slide. So there are really 6 criteria areas. I can walk through those, and then you'll see in the grid there's operationalizing concepts with them to think about how you would analyze and score around these criteria. So it's around prioritizing health, safety, and accessibility, promoting equity, supporting academic and co-curricular excellence, expanding community use, bolstering retention and recruitment, and improving space use and operational efficiency. Now, these aren't in any particular order, and they would be analyzed sort of all together to give a robust picture. So you can think of the 6 considerations around boundaries, some of these concepts where it's a structure to look at the project itself and to get our thinking together on that.
So here's how this might play out. I hope you can see that what's on the screen here. Imagine working in this way, as opposed to any particular project. But imagine this process, if you will. We come back, after we get direction from the board, we come back in this example, November, operations work group, and we say, based on our canvas of all issues, great and small, regarding CIP, we think that this is sort of the universe of issues. We think that these 5, 4, 6 issues are the ones that are strategically most important and right for the board to consider. Right? We bring that to you, and we get your reaction to that, either a go or no go to take these ideas out to the community and get community engagement feedback on them. We come back to you in March and say, well, we've talked to the community based on the list that you pre-approved, and they agree or disagree or have added or edited these other major CIP concerns that were not on our radar. So the board takes that into consideration. Now we're building the budget, annual operating budget for the ensuing year, and we might say, all right, well, it's looking like a new school might be needed in area X. That involves all sorts of early due diligence type of expenditures. So we'd want to build that into the operating budget. Surveyors, land acquisition costs, engineering studies, all that type of thing. So you'd want to at least have that budget timeline awareness. And then we would, I think according to this schedule, which I can't know if you can see the lines up there, but we would fully develop one or two key issues based on, again, the board's input and the community's input, and bring those back in this case, March of 20. So there's almost an 18 to 20 month period, realizing the complexity of the issues that are involved and the city approvals and what have you. So, so what we're saying is we'd be identifying issues as early as this November, coming back in March for clarification, whittling it down, further developing these to the point where it would be ripe for real consideration, fully vetted by early 2000. The idea being that if you want the item on the ballot in November of 2000, you have to have all of these answers, all this impact, all the financial work done ahead of time. You can't put it on the ballot unless it's super solid, right? So, and then if you did have it on the ballot in November of I'm sorry, what did I say? 2020. I left off the other 20. Thank you.
There's no year here. There's no year.
That's right. And I'm worried about this Y2K thing also. And I want to address that tonight. Sorry. 2020. If it were on the ballot in 2020, the facility, if it were like a new school, you'd be looking at September of 23. So the point here is these things take a long time. And regardless of what the issues are, we would recommend that this become a 4-year cycle. Of 3 years before the next presidential, you are formulating the large list, narrowing it down, authorizing in-depth studies, community engagement with the idea that you'd be at the board early in the presidential election year in 4-year cycles.
Right, so just to clarify, that means on a 4-year cycle, you would have a referendum question on the CMP package, and you might, if the board found a project or two in the CIP category that you wanted to take on, you might additionally have a second question
That's right.
on the ballot.
That's right.
And we get ourselves into a 4-year cycle.
Where you referendum both.
Correct.
2 questions on a single ballot.
Yeah. That's what we're thinking about.
We have today no structure, no way of working around these issues. This is our attempt to bring permanent processes to it. And I'll pause there.
Nikki?
Does this take into account the fact of the possible bill that has been being passed that would limit the ability to file for referendum? School boards would be limited by the ability to file for a referendum.
That's to exceed revenue limits, isn't it? That bill.
Right.
So it wouldn't conflict with the
cover this. I
facilities
needed
referendum.
to make sure of that.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to make sure, because I'd like to cover the revenue limit doesn't.
And this intends to be matched to the presidential ballot, which is always the highest turnout.
That's
So
right.
there's no attempt here to sneak one through on some low turnout election. This is playing it as fair and square as you can.
Yep.
Kate?
So maybe backing up to the kind of criteria and how we as a district want to think about investments in facilities. I think facilities is a really important topic, and I think for me, and I hear it from a lot of people, both from staff and from families and parents that our surrounding districts are building new schools, right? Largely driven by enrollment needs, but they are, they allow for different functionality than our schools do in some cases because of flexibility of rooms, because of technology. And I think, so I think we have a competitive issue in part around our facilities that we need to be pretty aware of. It doesn't necessarily directly drive student performance. I think there's an enrollment question that is fair to include here around just how competitive are we in this area, and how do our facilities stack up outside of even our own schools compared to one another. So that would be one. And then just bigger picture, I mean, I think if we want to be a leading district where the best staff want to work and where we're doing the most exciting things and we're retaining and attracting people to our city, not just for our schools, but for our economy and for our businesses, we have to be kind of at the forefront of everything one can do if we have new facilities, right? We are bound by these really old assets and we tie ourselves in knots sometimes around class size and busing and structurally how we educate children because we're bound by 50 to 100-year-old assets. There's no other industry where we would let ourselves be bound in such a way and not be flexible to make the choices we want just because of facilities, particularly given that we're in such a great financial position now and expect to continue to be in the future. So I actually, when I kind of read your example projects, I would love to think even bigger about what is possible. And maybe they won't be the right things to do, but I certainly wouldn't want to not have big choices be on the table. And when I say big choices, I mean things like fundamentally replacing schools even without an enrollment change in that district, or replacing 2 small schools with a medium-sized school. We have many elementary schools in the 200 range. They're more costly per student to run. Could we replace 2 older schools with one in the 400 range that's just more efficient and maybe offers more flexible instructional space? So I would, and thinking holistically about cost in that way so that we can say, is it worth replacing the boiler at Randall every 15 years for the next, are we going to do it for 100 years? And maybe Randall's not a good example. It's a beautiful old building. There's differences in our buildings, right? Yeah. But, if we're going to invest a lot of money just to keep up a sort of C quality facility, at what point does it make sense for us to say as a community, we actually want A quality facilities and we're going to look at the long run because we are going to be a great community in the long run, and invest in those facilities to make sure that we're all excited about where we show up for work and where our kids go to school. So I would be very holistic and think long term, I guess, in terms of like our criteria, and think about what is the most cost efficient thing in the mid to long term. A couple of other comments and then I'll stop, but there were a couple of specific things that I didn't see in here that I had questions around. One was our alternative schools, and the charter kind of alternative world is evolving. In the next 20 years it will significantly evolve, I would guess. I don't know what that will look like, but I would expect, the facilities improvements that we just talked about with IMA are real because they have a structurally different educational model that requires different facilities. So how does that play in here, and how does, it really comes back to me to flexibility of space. How do we think about the value of flexibility, and what does that structurally look like? I don't know. I do think boundaries are a real question here. It looked to me like the memorial attendance area was the one with the most motion in terms of what we expect. But I think that boundaries are an important part of this. The only other criteria I didn't kind of see that I would expect is literally just the number of kids impacted.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
I would love to so just, making sure that we're not spending a lot of money on a super small set of kids. And then maybe coming full circle back to how I started, which is just, if we want to be bold about how we think about what we really want from facilities instead of spending a lot of money on what we really don't want. So not lots of little projects that kind of keep us just barely treading water with our mouth just a little bit above the surface, right? But how are we really making forward progress? And maybe that's fewer, bigger projects. I don't know. But I would be very holistic and be bold about at least what we consider. We don't have to make those choices. So that was a long, sorry.
One question, then a couple comments. The question is, when you talk about those planning costs to go to a big CIP project, what range are we talking? 200,000, 400,000, 500,000?
Ultimately, I think you have to spend an amount sufficient to where you've proven due diligence and not made a mistake. So I would view that typically in the hundreds of thousands, but not millions. I mean, you don't want to spend so much that then if the community rejects the idea, that you wasted enormous resources. So there's a balance there, just enough to make sure the community can cast an informed vote.
I was just going to say that I was talking with a county board member recently and said, the last thing I want is another $400,000 spent on planning the jail. Just do something, and I mean, and you know, and they keep spending $400,000 on planning, and so I guess that didn't want to communicate that. In terms of the boundaries, I mean not the boundaries, the priorities, the guidelines, whatever that's called. One general comment is that these are different for planning a new facility and planning something around existing. And I think that that's not really, they're kind of like this, these seem to be universal, and I think that we need a different set of questions to ask. You know, one is, when is Sprecher Road need a building is different than asking, does Leopold need another is Leopold, I mean, they're different questions. Do the alternatives need a building? That's a different question. Secondly, I understand that you need to look at this holistically and that you need to kind of balance all these things, but one of the things I never liked, Beth, you referenced the boundaries set. One of the things I never liked about that is that they're not prioritized. And so that you can look, so that anybody can grab, and I think that having some sense of priorities in advance before you look at specific projects is very important. Not just a list of priorities, but you know what? These three are more important than these three. And it doesn't have to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but it has to, having that discussion before you have something in front of you, I think is really important for how you do it. So I would suggest that we revisit this and think about that as a board and as a community and bring it back to the community, what really is important here. Because I don't think things are equally important. And then kind of back to the question about improving versus changing. I think that, you know, are we creating diverse populations in schools? Are we, not only are we, where the improvement goes, is it diverse, but are we creating socioeconomically diverse environments in our schools through our building? And then finally, you know, kind of listening to Kate and listening to Mary, you know, I found myself very sympathetic with Mary when she was talking about, you know, how does this relate to our big project, which is student achievement, I mean, which is student learning. And, you know, and I think that we all need to kind of reflect on that, and that's partially communication, but I think it's also kind of a conceptual issue. And, you know, one partial answer, but this only takes us this far. It doesn't take us to this level of spending, but it takes us to this level of spending, is that we have to demonstrate to our students that school is a place where people have pride in their work, that this is a place where this is an important place. This is a place that is treated with respect by those who are in charge of it. And I think that, you know, to some level, just appearance, be it cleanliness, but also, you know, the aesthetics of it, having bathrooms that work, because you know, schools aren't, you know, if they can't fix the damn bathroom, schools are not an important place. That's the hidden curriculum that's being sent. So I think at some level that's answered in that way, but I'm not quite sure that brings us to $10 million a year. So that's just my comment on that.
Okay, Anna.
I just had one comment, and I'm not even sure if it's relevant to this discussion, but because there was a mention in regard to boundary changes, I'm wondering at what point we'll be or if we ever will be discussing the current pairings that we have in the school district. I know those were done decades ago. There's been significant demographic changes within the schools, and I do think there is, you know, an extra financial cost of busing students back and forth, and that also is, you know, keeping families isolated from their schools that don't have access to transportation again. And so at just some point, I'm wondering if we'll ever be revisiting those decisions made.
The boundary discussion was part of our long-range facilities plan. It was one of the critical components. Can you guys let the board know where we are at in our analysis of boundaries?
Yeah, so yeah, our work does not lead with boundary change, but we're critically aware of how important boundaries are. I think our overall approach has been that where boundaries have been, where they exist and where they are supportive of a positive school community, leave them alone. The more boundaries you change, frankly, the more disturbance it creates, and you don't want to necessarily change boundaries to change boundaries. Where we see a boundary where it no longer makes sense, or where it has become a negative factor, then we would propose to change it. And that's you know, kind of all part of this work. We didn't call it out in this presentation, but it's very much a part of long-range facility planning.
Yeah. Well, we'll take that, and I do think there's probably some additional analysis we need to do on your behalf. I mean, I think this gets to TJ's comments about a couple of our schools who may be somewhat under-enrolled, where that could be one solution, but certainly not the only solution. And your point about paired schools, that's come up repeatedly. The lack of a school in Ally Drive, for example, has come up repeatedly. It definitely needs to continue to live as part of this plan.
Okay, we are going to move on then to the proposed equity policy. Thanks,
Okay,
Chad
thanks
and
for your
Mike
input. We really appreciate
and
it.
Beth for the great work. So this has now been, I think, the third time that we have had discussion on this. So I'm hoping that, Dylan, we can move through this fairly quickly and board can get any comments. Fourth time, yeah. So
Relatively few changes since we discussed it at the retreat. One of the primary changes I do want to point out is an expansion of the definition of the word universal, because we had been reusing and cross-using the word universal for universal goals as well as universal versus targeted, and some skinnying down. There is a reliance on the equity tool that continues to be included, but that is where we currently are. We are looking for an approval at the end of July. Yeah.
I would only add that the policy states that we will adopt or create kind of a simple tool, which we discussed at the last board retreat, which would include questions that would help the staff and the board vet proposals, both policy and resource allocation decisions. That tool is not in existence yet. So our goal would be that you would at least be able to see it and get some sense of it by the July board meeting, with the goal of having it ready for use by the fall. But the policy itself, you would be approving the policy, not the tool.
yes.
So I just wanted to clarify that.
TJ?
Thank you for the work, Dylan. I'll start out with the tool. I think it's important that the board do two things in relation to the tool. One is that approve it. That I think that it, this is the heart of the implementation, and that we shouldn't develop it ourselves, but I think that that the administration should bring it to us for approval. And secondly, I think that we need some clarity around how and when it's used. One of the issues that's come up with the city's use of their equity tool has been, when the hell do we use it? And it turns out that they use it when it's convenient. And so I think that some clarity around that would be really good. That that maybe we can use it beyond these certain times, but these are times we have to use it. We must use it. So defining some kind of set of those, and similar things with the reporting metrics. I think that that also that bringing those board for approval would be. We've had a lot of talks about what information is useful for us to understand how the district's doing, and I think equity is an area where that the administration should suggest to us that this is how we're going to measure it, and we should say yes, that's how to measure it, or maybe we want to measure it slightly differently, or things like that. So those are the two places where I would ask for changes, or three if you want to count the application of the tool. But again, thanks for the work.
Okay.
Maybe just on the metrics.
Yeah,
point,
of course.
I actually would appreciate some insight into what metrics. I don't think the policy is probably the right place. I mean, this policy is updated every 10 years, and we're going to want to refresh those more frequently, I would guess.
And then I think when they get refreshed, they will come back for approval. I don't think they get incorporated into the policy for approval. I'm saying that it's a separate process to approve the metrics.
Okay, fair point. I would love
yeah.
insight. I'm not sure, I'm not sure the right process to go through it, but I would actually, I think just some clarity on that would be helpful.
Okay.
I guess that's it. I'm not hearing any more comments.
Well, so
Let's.
it's very confusing. So I just want to. So I try to be mindful of when I hear a suggestion from one person versus the board.
That's what we're trying to get at.
And that is kind of what I'm hearing right now is a singular suggestion, which if it is of the board, but that is for, right now the suggestion is to approve the policy. I'm hearing TJ and I want to clarify policy proper, and then individually, but still with board approval, the metrics by which implementation of the policy would be measured, as well as the equity tool.
To incorporate those approvals into the policy. So the policy references that those are approved by the board.
At whatever point they get approved.
Yeah. And so those are not, the tools themselves are not, those pieces aren't incorporated into the policy, but board approval is referenced in the policy. And I don't know if other people support it or not.
Yeah, Anna?
That was my question.
I support that.
Kate?
So I would love insight into the metrics. I don't feel strongly whether it's in the policy or not. The tool, to be honest, I just don't think we're going to be as, I'm not sure what our approval would actually do if we're not actually using it. That my experience with tools is you kind of have to use them.
To know if they work or not, yeah.
Metrics for me are more useful, but.
I would second Kate on the metrics versus the tools. TJ, do you have the, do you understand or feel?
I think that, the tool as I envision it and the equity tools I've seen from other people are a series of questions that get asked and then lead to some kind of analysis via the answers. I think what those questions are is very important. And in fact, the draft, I believe that the one we saw at the retreat had some that was the affirmative action plan had an equity tool attached to it. And I think that what those questions are and how those questions are phrased, you can zero in on things and highlight particular things, or you can go right past things. And so I think that, having a chance to have that conversation back and forth, and Kate, you said that the board isn't using it, but in fact, we will be the administration will be using this to make recommendations to the board, and the board will be looking at these analyses as we take votes on those recommendations. So we are second-level users, but we are still users.
So maybe I can say differently, until I see what we're talking about, it's sort of hard for me to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to.
I've seen
say.
a dozen, and you know, and differences appear subtle, and as you said, you really don't know till you see it in practice. So I think that we'll be taking our best guesses as we do this, but I'd rather have 7 of us taking our best guesses on a recommendation done by the professional knowledge of our staff than just the professional knowledge of our staff.
Nikki?
Gotta go with TJ on this one. How you ask a question can totally change the answer. Wording, phrasing, vocabulary, those things do matter. They do affect equity because they do affect how people react to them. I think having a set of questions, we need to take that into account, so I have to back him on that.
Okay, so Dylan, I think what I'm hearing is the board supports TJ's recommendation.
That's helpful.
Okay. Well, great. With that, is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second? I'll make the second. No second. Morton, your advisory vote?
Aye.
All in favor?
Aye.
Hi.
Okay, we are adjourned.